Welcome, everyone, to this online public meeting called by the Socialist Equality Party, the Australian section of the International Committee of the Fourth International. My name is Mike Head, and I'll chair today's meeting. I'm a member of the National Committee of the SEP and a correspondent for the World Socialist website. Today's meeting is titled Defeat Anti-Democratic Election Laws, Become an Electoral Member of the SEP. Now, we called this public event as part of the SEP's campaign throughout the working class against the naked anti-democratic electoral laws that the Liberal National Government and the Labor Party joined hands to steamroller through both houses of Parliament within 24 hours late last month. These measures are part of an escalating assault on the democratic and social rights of the working class in Australia and internationally, which the ruling class is intensifying as its profit-driven reopening drive to make us, quote, live with the virus causes a terrible worsening of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Labor Party opposition conspired with the Morrison government to pass the legislation completely behind the backs of the working class, aided by a wall of silence in the corporate media. This is a desperate bid to prop up the discredited political establishment and suppress dissent. But the secrecy surrounding it and the continuing lack of any coverage in the media reveals a nervousness in the ruling class over the response of workers and youth. The new laws compel political parties that do not have a seat in Parliament to submit lists of 1,500 members to the Australian Electoral Commission, trebling the previous requirement. With the Delta virus raging in many parts of the country and threatening a public health system breakdown, the SEP and 35 other currently registered parties have only until December the 2nd to present expanded lists of members or be automatically deregistered. If we fail to do that, we'll be stripped of the elementary democratic right to stand candidates in federal elections with our party names on ballot papers. Now, a warning must be issued. There is a profoundly anti-democratic content and logic to this. Both the government and the Labor Party insist that being able to stand as a candidate under a party name is a privilege, not a right, and that an arbitrary figure of 1,500 members is needed to prove so-called sufficient community support. But that overrides the very function of elections themselves, which are meant to allow the voters to determine which political parties and programs they support. In another naked act of political censorship, the new laws give the Electoral Commission the power to deregister parties that have historically significant political words in their party names, such as socialist or communist, if a previously registered party has claimed that label. The SEP is demanding the repeal of these laws and the removal of all restrictions on the right of parties and individuals to run in elections. At the same time, we are appealing to our readers and supporters and everyone participating in this meeting, apply to become electoral members of the SEP and urge others also to apply to become electoral members of the party so that we can meet the 1,500 member requirement. That will help ensure that we can advance and make as broadly known as possible a genuine socialist perspective at the next election, which is due before May. As we explain on our online electoral membership application form, quote, the working class must have a political voice, which the ruling class through its latest legislation is seeking to stifle. The opposition to the dictates of big business and its political servants needs to be guided by a socialist program that puts the social needs of working people, above all their health and lives, ahead of the private profits of the wealthy few. The SEP alone fights for this perspective. We have three speakers today. The first is Cheryl Crisp, the National Secretary of the SEP. The second is Oscar Grenfell, a leading member of our youth movement. the International Youth and Students for Social Equality and a World Socialist website correspondent. And we are very pleased to have as our third speaker, Eric London, a leading member of the SEP in the United States and a writer for the WSWS, who will help place our discussion in the context of the enormous political crisis in the US and globally. Allow me to briefly speak to the connection between the fight against the party deregistration laws and the underlying political and social crisis. Why are the ruling class and its political servants trying to silence dissent and especially support for socialism? The answer lies in the COVID-19 pandemic, the accelerating income and wealth inequality, the debacle in Afghanistan, and the new anti-China pact and war preparations announced by the governments of the United States, Britain, and Australia this week. For the past 4 decades, the struggles of workers in this country and internationally have been systematically suppressed by the trade union apparatuses, which now function as industrial police forces on behalf of the corporate ruling class. But there is now a growing working class movement, including against the catastrophe unleashed on the world's population by the ruling elite's refusal to take the measures necessary to protect people from the coronavirus, creating the conditions for more infectious and deadly mutants like Delta to proliferate. So far, more than 4.7 million people have died unnecessarily worldwide, and nearly 230 million have been infected, according to the officially recorded cases, with the true tolls perhaps double those. This is a capitalist class policy of mass death. The excess deaths in the United States, the headquarters of global capitalism, already exceed 1 million. And the disasters developing in Sydney and Melbourne show how quickly the profit-driven reopening of the economy by governments can allow the pandemic to spiral out of control. The worsening global COVID-19 pandemic is also being used to accelerate the corporate restructuring of society in the interests of the wealthy elite. Workers face pay cuts, declining conditions, starvation level assistance packages if they're thrown out of a job by the pandemic. But the wealth of the super rich has soared to staggering heights in Australia, as it has internationally. According to the Australian Financial Review Rich List, the fortunes of Australia's wealthiest 200 individuals and families have soared rapidly to nearly $500 billion, or 6 times the annual total federal government spending on health during the pandemic. The international working class is the only social force that can halt the worldwide pandemic calamity by taking the political and economic power out of the hands of the capitalist class and reorganizing society worldwide on a socialist basis in the interests of all, not the super rich. And this necessity is underscored by the growing danger of another world war. The ignominious debacle suffered by the US and its allies, including Australia, with the fall of Kabul after 20 years of barbaric war, has further exposed the criminal character of the US wars in the Middle East and Central Asia, which were never about the democratic or human rights of the people. But the defeat in Afghanistan has only intensified the US war drive against China, its main perceived threat to the global hegemony that US imperialism asserted as a result of World War II. The new AUKUS alliance, unveiled this week, is about much more than nuclear-powered submarines, as important as that is. It marks an open preparation for war against China by 2 major imperialist powers, the US and the UK, with Australia on the front line. The fault lines of a disastrous new world war are rapidly emerging. Australia is to become a giant US base with thousands of US troops, warplanes, nuclear-armed warships, and other essential warfighting facilities, in addition to the already existing key bases like the Pine Gap satellite communications and weapons guidance station in Central Australia. The negotiations between the US, Britain, and Australia on the AUKUS alliance were underway behind closed doors for months, without the slightest mention in the parliaments or Congress. This complete secrecy reflects the fear in ruling circles in Washington, London and Canberra of the widespread anti-war sentiment among workers and youth. But this sentiment needs a clear perspective and leadership. The only means for halting the catastrophic drive toward conflict between nuclear armed powers is to forge an international anti-war movement of the working class on the basis of a socialist program to put an end to the capitalist system and its reactionary division of the world into rival nation states. Our first speaker today is Cheryl Crisp, the SEP National Secretary and a founding member of our party in Australia in 1972. Cheryl has played a leading part in the fight for socialism in Australia and internationally for more than 4 decades. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thanks, Mike. And I'd also like to welcome everybody in this meeting this afternoon. As Mike has outlined, on August the 26th, the Australian government passed legislation with the full support of the Labor opposition, which will effectively deregister 36 minor parties. This legislation, which by any objective measure is a serious attack on democratic rights, on freedom of speech, and on the ability of political parties to effectively present an alternative to the two-party system of Liberal and Labor. It appeared to come out of the blue. That was because it was accompanied by a conspiracy of silence by the government, the major parties, specifically Labor, and the media, before and after the legislation was rushed through Parliament. To this day, there has been virtually no reporting of it. The attack is certainly aimed at minor parties, but it is far more directed against the opposition which exists in the working class and to prevent that opposition from turning to an independent and socialist direction. And so the announcement on Thursday morning by President Biden, Prime Ministers Johnson and Morrison of the new alliance between the United States, the United Kingdom and Australia, where for the first time, Australia will be provided with nuclear-powered submarines, places both the electoral legislation and how it was rammed through Parliament in a greater context. The US, with Australia and Britain at its flanks, are spearheading a military confrontation with a nuclear-armed rival, and the Australian population is being placed at the very front on the front lines of such a conflict. This is a massive and dangerous step toward war with China, but which could embroil the world. It was not discussed in Parliament either here, in the United Kingdom, or in Congress in the US. It was not put to the Australian population during an election campaign. It was not reported by any government official or media outlet. No one was given a say in this decision. The electoral laws, therefore, must be seen in this context, and I will return to the question of the AUKUS alliance later in my remarks. As Mike said, these new electoral laws requires that all minor parties without a member of Parliament must now provide treble the previously stipulated 500 members or to be deregistered. So that means that we have to provide 1,500 members to the Australian Electoral Commission. Parties with members of Parliament are not required to meet this stipulation. And I think we need to be clear on this. For parties with one member of Parliament, the only member which counts is that member of Parliament. And of the list of the 1,500 members submitted to the AEC, a sample of those members are then rung or emailed by representatives of the AEC to confirm membership. The whole process completely eviscerates the concept of secret ballots. And if the party fails in this incredibly onerous and undemocratic process, deregistration follows, which means that the parties which are unregistered, stand in federal elections will not have their party name on the ballot. So the more than 25% and increasing number of voters who rejected Liberal and Labor in the 2019 elections and prior won't be able to identify the party of their choice with whom they would want to vote. But even if the parties reach the 1,500 membership list, the AEC can still reject the submission if the party's name contains a word which is also used by an already registered party unless written consent from that party is provided. So what that means is that political parties now own words. The fact that there are at present 3 registered parties with the name Socialist means that the first registered of those parties, which appears to be Socialist Alliance by a period of 2 weeks, can prevent the other 2 parties from standing under a name which in the case of the SEP we have used for almost 50 years. So the capitalist state has, in this case, effectively deputised Socialist Alliance with the power to strip the SEP of the use of its name. Now, the Socialist Equality Party has already declared it will not veto the use of the word socialist, which is a principle, and calls on all other parties to do the same. To date, Socialist Alliance has not responded. This legislation is part of the response of the Australian political establishment to the pandemic and growing opposition to its policies, which have been underway for decades. It is in line with the international shift by capitalist governments and the capitalist class as a whole to authoritarian forms of rule. Some 18 months ago, on March the 29th, 2020, the International Committee of the Fourth International, of which the SEP is the Australian section, convened an international online forum to discuss the growing pandemic, which by then had recorded worldwide 734,000 cases and almost 36,000 deaths. David North, a leading member of the ICFI and the US SEP, stated in that meeting that the pandemic was a trigger event, comparable to that of the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand in June 1914, which set into motion events which culminated 5 weeks later in the outbreak of World War I. He said, and I quote, "The assassination did no more than determine the date of the war's outbreak. But the war itself, that is, the explosion of the global contradictions of capitalist national rivalries and the economics of imperialism, was inevitable." And then he goes on, "The pandemic bears the same relationship to the present crisis. The historic character of this event arises out of the response to the pandemic, the manner in which it has so completely exposed the comprehensive failure of the existing society, the ignorance and inhumanity of its political leaders, the corruption and venality of its ruling class, the incompetence of its institutions, and the intellectual and moral bankruptcy of its phony, media-created heroes and even phonier values." He raised that capitalism had once again become a dirty word, and that the socialism of Lenin, Trotsky, and Rosa Luxemburg, not that of Bernie Sanders et al., will once again become a mass movement throughout the world. 18 months on, there is nothing in that analysis which should be revised or taken back. The pandemic has accelerated processes which were underway prior to its outbreak. In the course of the past 18 months, another 230 million people have been infected with coronavirus, and almost 4.7 million have died. The vast majority of these deaths were entirely unnecessary and were the result of decisions made by capitalist governments in response to the virus. In the United States, 1 in 500 Americans have died from the virus, and 1 in 35 over the age of 85 years of age have died. So let's consider this. In the 21st century, with man's unparalleled knowledge of science, medicine, and technology, whole sections of an entire generation are perishing, not because they had to, but because of the conscious decisions of capitalist governments. This is a staggering indictment, not just of the United States administrations and the decisions of those governments, Republican and Democrat alike, but of the entire capitalist system. The same processes, if not the same numbers, are underway in this country. For more than a year, the population has been told that Australia dodged a bullet, that the government met the challenge of COVID. To the extent that governments enacted any measures, it was always under the immense pressure of demand from the working class. Elections held in the course of the past 18 months saw landslide returns of state governments associated, in many cases falsely, with the measures that suppressed the virus outbreak. But no government, whether federal or state, ever adopted a policy of eradication of the virus, only suppression. And as suppression is incapable of dealing with the Delta variant of the virus, the inevitable resurfacing of it was only a matter of time. 3 months ago, there were no community transmission in New South Wales. Yesterday, it passed the 45,000 infection mark. But corporate interests in this country will no longer tolerate measures that impact on their profits and production. Profits over lives was always the approach of the ruling class, and it is being demanded to be undertaken and taken to its logical conclusion. The mantra is vaccination is all that's needed to put lockdowns behind us. Schools must return to face-to-face learning. The economy must reopen. And we have to, quote, learn to live with the virus. And this is while infection rates increase, deaths rise, ICU wards fill, and hospitals teeter on the brink of collapse. Healthcare workers are entirely overwhelmed. In New South Wales, the Berejiklian government has dispensed with daily press conferences to report on rates of infection. They had also dispensed with the information on transmission sites, and contact tracing is being wound back. This has now been embraced by the Andrews government in Victoria, which is a Labor government. And in that state, the rate of infection is actually higher than in New South Wales at the same stage. This policy is opposed by broad sections of the working class and the population. And so it is under these conditions that the new electoral laws were rushed through Parliament. In 2019, in the election of that year, both parties, Liberal and Labor, lost votes, with Labor plummeting to 33% of first preference votes. And this was mainly in working class areas. Its collapse of support handed victory to the coalition government in what was the face of certain defeat. That trend has only intensified in the 2 years since. Recent polls indicate that Liberal first preference votes are as low as 36%, with Labor not far behind. In fact, the only parties whose support has increased is the minor parties, and it is those that have been the subject of this deregistration legislation. But these measures are certainly not just the province of the Liberals and coalition government. In fact, it was Labor which spearheaded similar laws when the Hawke-Keating government in 1984 introduced registration of political parties, requiring lists of then 500 members to be submitted for parties without parliamentary representation. This was introduced for exactly the same reasons that they have now been strengthened. to ensure that any opposition which was developing and growing was unable to break free from the trap of parliamentary democracy and the two-party system. But it has to be said that it was largely unsuccessful then in stemming the tide against both political parties, and that is the reason for its strengthening. At the same time, and without coincidence, the same Hawke Labor government introduced some of the most onerous anti-strike legislation that had been seen in the world, which banned all industrial action other than those sanctioned by the Industrial Relations Tribunal. This was possible only because of the support of the Stalinist Communist Party union leaders. These anti-working class measures were then strengthened by both Rudd and Gillard Labor governments and enshrined by coalition governments which followed them. Far from the union leadership opposing these laws, they were seen as a lifeline, as a means of suppressing any action of workers. Only the Socialist Labour League and then the Socialist Equality Party opposed these attacks, as opposed to the positions of the Pabloite and pseudo-left outfits whose role was only to pressure the unions and Labour. A little over a week after the election laws were given royal assent, meaning that they became law, the Australian High Court delivered a ruling which makes organisations, including political parties, legally liable for third-party comments placed on the organisation's websites which are deemed to be defamatory. It makes no difference, according to the High Court, that the comments were not solicited, that they were not agreed with, or that they were not even known about by the organisation whose site they were posted on. It means that media outlets and organisations, in order to protect themselves from defamation action, will have to hide third-party comments until they are checked for defamation and then posted. It, of course, exposes parties and organisations who don't have the resources to monitor comments on a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week basis. And the comments themselves that are deemed to be defamatory can be sourced from overseas. Even if the comments are removed, it can, but doesn't necessarily, protect the Facebook owner completely. This also applies to Twitter and other social media outlets. It is, of course, of a piece with the international drive for internet censorship to curtail discussion and political interaction. These assaults on democratic rights have always been a prelude to the drive to war, and it is the case now. The entire political elite are conscious of the anti-war sentiment which exists amongst broad sections of people in this country and internationally, and it has been demonstrated throughout the past decades. The decision by the US, the UK and Australia is a reckless one, which can rightly and has rightly been seen by China as an act of escalated aggression against it. Chinese military spokesmen are reported as saying that this act will, quote, potentially make Australia a target of a nuclear strike. And it's true. The US and Australian governments have spearheaded provocation after provocation against China, dating back to Obama's pivot to Asia, announced in 2011 to the Australian Parliament under the Labor Julia Gillard's government. While the deal on nuclear-powered submarines is certainly a major factor of the agreement, Defence Minister Dutton, who with Foreign Minister Payne is in the United States for the OSMIN talks, has raised that more fighter planes, more warships, and more US troops will be deployed in Australia, including the possibility of US bases here. Australia is being turned into a giant aircraft carrier for the military and economic interests of the US, the UK, and Australian imperialism. the unedifying and chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan by the United States and Australia and the UK was driven by the need to deploy resources to what is classified as a more dangerous foe, China and possibly Russia. The fact that it was carried out in the debacle it became is because the need was urgent. Old alliances are threatened and old rivalries reprised. France, who has withdrawn its ambassadors from the United States and Australia for the first time ever, has described, quote, being stabbed in the back by both Australia and the United States. Whether this new agreement impacts on EU trade deals is yet to be determined. One can see, however, how overnight pacts, alliances, and inter-imperialist friendships can be thrown to the wind and transformed into antagonists overnight. But as the ICFI has always warned, war abroad means war against the working class at home. The world faces the renewed threat of war, not regional or localised, but the danger of armed conflict against nuclear armed countries, the top two most powerful countries on earth. And this can very well take on a global dimension. The development of the pandemic has revealed the capitalist class is incapable and uninterested in developing policies in the interests of society. Its concern is the protection of the wealth of the tiny few. If in the interests of that elite few world war is required, then it will go down that path, as it has done twice before in the 20th century. The rapid transformation of political events is itself a characteristic of pre-revolutionary and revolutionary periods. Another is the shift in consciousness of the masses, a process which is evident in the growing opposition to the policies of governments who are willing to sacrifice lives for profit. It is also clear that this growing opposition is directed against those who have acted as the policemen for the capitalist class, particularly the trade unions. Only the working class can prevent the descent into war. Only the working class can intervene with an opposed political perspective based on the interests of the whole of mankind. That requires the international action and unification of all sections of the working class based upon the overthrow of the system which now threatens the very existence of mankind, capitalism. It requires a socialist perspective. That perspective exists in the form of the International Committee of the Fourth International and the Socialist Equality Party. It is time for all in this meeting to take a stand, to leave the sidelines, join the SEP as an electoral member. Take your stand in the fight, not just against these electoral laws, but to defeat them nevertheless, but to also join as a full member of the SEP and to make the most important decision of your life in taking your role and placing yourself in the fight for the overthrow of capitalism and the introduction of a socialist society. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Cheryl. Our second speaker today is Oscar Grenfell, who represents a new generation in the struggle for socialism, having joined the SEP in 2007 and is now a leading writer for the World Socialist website. Welcome, Oscar.
There's a very direct connection between the electoral laws that we're fighting and the escalation of the pandemic in Australia and internationally. It's no accident that one of the Australian ruling elite's most significant attacks on democratic rights coincides with the deepest medical and political crisis of the past 80 years and the open adoption by capitalist governments of policies that can only be described as homicidal. In the first place, this legislation was rammed through Parliament amid mass infections in Sydney and Melbourne, the country's largest cities, conditions which made campaigning and other forms of physical political activity impossible. Parties without the vast corporate and state resources of the parliamentary outfits are being compelled to treble their membership within just 3 months, when they're unable to speak to people on the street, distribute leaflets, or hold physical meetings. Labor and the coalition are thereby exploiting the health disaster that their own pro-business policies have created to try and wipe any political alternative from the ballot. More fundamentally, the pandemic is a turning point in history, accelerating all of the underlying social, political, and economic crises of the capitalist system. Above all, the catastrophe of COVID-19 and the clear culpability of the ruling elites are politically radicalising millions of workers and young people, intensifying the mass opposition that already existed to inequality, the dominance over society by a tiny corporate elite, and the programs of austerity and war. With the electoral laws, the establishment parties are seeking to prevent this sentiment from finding political expression. Their attack on political rights goes hand in hand with the suppression of information about the pandemic, the endangerment of workers' safety, and declarations that the population must learn to live with the deadly virus. We're linking our campaign against these laws with the fight to mobilise the working class in defence of health, safety, and for a scientifically grounded program aimed at eradicating COVID. Against the ruling class program of death, the working class must have its own voice and perspective, which these laws seek to prevent. These are international issues. As Cheryl reviewed, the official global death toll throughout the pandemic stands at 4.6 million, but the real count is undoubtedly far higher. Studies examining excess deaths, including one by The Economist last May, placed the true number of fatalities somewhere between 7 and 13 million. That is more than the population of any Australian city. Around the world, the pandemic is resurging, with governments allowing the unchecked spread of the Delta variant as they end lockdowns and lift all safety measures so that full corporate profit-making activities can resume. In the US, this program, which is being implemented by the Biden administration, has led to daily infections soaring back above 150,000, compared with 20,000 a day in late June and early July. Some 1,500 deaths are being reported every day, and the country just passed a grim milestone of 1 out of every 500 people having died of COVID, up from 1 in 1,000 a year ago. In Britain, the government is declaring that the virus is endemic and mass death will be the norm for years to come. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said he's prepared to accept 50,000 deaths from COVID every single year. Now, over the past 4 months, claims that Australia had escaped the worst of the pandemic and that its governments had stewarded the country through this crisis have been exposed as lies. These exceptionalist nostrums were always a sham. All of the country's governments, Labor and Liberal National, rejected a strategy to eradicate COVID in the earliest stages of the pandemic on the grounds that it would be too costly. From this flowed their refusal to develop a safe quarantine program and their staunch resistance to lockdown measures during every outbreak. With the current surge, what has been implicit all along has become explicit. It's now undeniable that governments here, state and federal, have pursued the same criminal pro-business policies as their counterparts in the US, Britain, and internationally. When cases were first detected in Sydney last June, the sole preoccupation of the New South Wales government was to prevent any sort of lockdown. The entirely predictable consequence was that the Delta variant would spread like wildfire, as it has. What has been pursued since is a brutal class war program fully supported by the state Labor opposition. Hundreds of military personnel and thousands of police have been in the working class western and southwestern suburbs of Sydney for months now, while residents have been vilified and scapegoated for the spread of the virus. But the lockdown has never extended to the primary source of transmission, that is to workplaces. In New South Wales, the trade unions, together with employer groups, successfully lobbied for a massive list of exemptions to workplace shutdowns and restrictions. 16 different sectors of retail have been exempted throughout the outbreak, along with almost all manufacturing and construction. The same is the case in Victoria, where under the state Labor government's lockdown, at least 13% of infections are related to construction, most of it patently not essential, except to the fortunes of the property developers. The refusal to implement any broad workplace shutdowns is why cases have continued to soar in both Sydney and Melbourne under conditions of supposed lockdowns, and why the infection toll is highest in the working class suburbs. But now the ruling class is taking the next step in line with its counterparts internationally. Together in the National Cabinet, all of the governments, Labor and Liberal National alike, signed off on a plan for an end to lockdowns and restrictions for all time last July. In August, this was tied to vaccination rates of 70% of the adult population, the lifting of lockdowns, and 80% for the end of virtually all safety restrictions. These vaccination targets are completely arbitrary. The 70% figure excludes everybody under the age of 16, meaning that it accounts for just 56% of the total population. And that's under conditions where almost a third of all cases in New South Wales have been among children and teenagers. More than 13,000 kids and teenagers in the state have been infected since June, most of them in Sydney. Similar trends have been evident in Victoria, where around 500 of the current active cases are among children younger than 9. With infections still rising, mass gatherings, pubs, restaurants, and virtually everything else is to be reopened, along with full in-person teaching in the schools from next month. The completely bipartisan character of this program is likely to be on display today, with Victorian Labor Premier Daniel Andrews touted to be releasing his own roadmap for reopening, having abandoned any pretense of trying to eliminate transmission earlier this month. The governments all admit that this program will lead to an increase in illness and death, but they say that this is the price that must be paid for a return to normality, to ensure business confidence and the like, all code words for maximising corporate profit. They've asserted, however, that whatever happens, the hospital systems will be able to cope. This is a lie that's being refuted every week by courageous whistleblowing health workers. Already, with some 1,250 COVID patients in New South Wales hospitals, 230 of them in intensive care, the system is on the brink of a breakdown. In Sydney hospitals, staff from neurology, cardiology, and even physiotherapy departments are being sent into COVID wards. We were told by a health worker that Liverpool Hospital stopped admitting COVID patients on Thursday because it was being overwhelmed, forcing them to be diverted to Wollongong, an hour and a half out of Sydney. The worker said that at Westmead Hospital, a vacuum insulated evaporator system, which supplies oxygen to the entire facility, is almost at capacity. These are two of the largest hospitals in Sydney, one of them unable to admit any more COVID patients, the other on the brink of running out of oxygen. The situation is the consequence of decades of cuts to the public healthcare system by Labor and Liberal governments and enforced by the trade unions. That's demonstrated by the fact that the hospitals in states such as South Australia and Western Australia are running at or above capacity and are facing acute staffing shortages, even though there's no COVID transmission there. While issuing hollow assurances, the New South Wales government's own modelling predicts that the state's hospitals will be overwhelmed late next month, right when the lockdown is set to be lifted. Hospitals would enter into a code black, signifying, quote, that demand for critical care services significantly exceeds organisation-wide capacity. The modelling, however, claims that this will be a passing state of affairs and that the system will stabilise in November. But this rosy assessment is because the government modelling doesn't take into account its own plan to lift restrictions and so predicts a decline in cases right at the point that they're likely to explode. The real situation was indicated by independent modelling conducted by AusSage, a group of leading epidemiologists who were challenging the government's reopening drive. They predict that if the government lifts restrictions at 70% adult vaccination and implements a full reopening at 80%, there will be 1,169 deaths in New South Wales by February 1, including the 200 or so fatalities that have already occurred in the current outbreak. The code black under this modelling would not last for a week in October, as the government claims, but for 5 weeks from early December into the first weeks of January. Now, the governments in New South Wales and elsewhere have said very little about what a code black would entail, but guidelines sent to ICU staff in New South Wales state that this would involve a triage system. The Saturday paper explained earlier this month, I quote, "In New South Wales, doctors and nurses have been told by hospital managers that life-saving support may not be provided or potentially even be withdrawn for those with a median age of 72 during the overwhelming phase of the current Delta outbreak, which is forecast for late October and early November." An August study led by Dr. Jai Darval from the Royal Melbourne Hospital found that the activation of these ICU protocols would exclude patients with a close to 80% hospital survival rate and a more than 30% 5-year survival rate. That is, people with an 8 in 10 chance of living, if they were provided with adequate care, will be left to die. This is the same scenario that played out in Italy in the earliest stages of the pandemic, and it's not simply a question of New South Wales. Victoria has even less ICU capacity, and its hospitals were almost overwhelmed during a surge of the virus last year. The same situation exists in every other state. This program is provoking mass opposition from healthcare workers. Last week, hundreds of New South Wales ICU nurses issued an open letter to the state government demanding a major increase to staffing and warning that the current situation is jeopardising their own health and their patients' lives. Almost every day, staff in the sector are risking their jobs, speaking to the media and exposing the government's lies. There is immense hostility among teachers to the prospect of a full return to classrooms next month. Even with schools operating at minimal attendance levels over the past 3 months, primarily supervising the children of essential workers, more than 150 schools in New South Wales have been shut after COVID exposures. Students are also speaking out, with several petitions condemning the reopening having been issued by Year 12 students who are also calling for their final exams to be postponed or cancelled. The opposition to the school reopenings is intersecting with anger over the fact that young people face a future of widespread unemployment, housing security, and precarious, low-paid casual work for those who find a job. And the anger among broad sections of the working class found initial expression in a snap walkout of bus drivers at the Smithfield depot in Western Sydney after one of their colleagues was infected earlier this month. Now, this emerging movement of workers and young people faces major political issues. First of all, experience has demonstrated that not a single step forward can be taken within the straitjacket of Labor and the unions. Labor, no less than Morrison, Berejiklian and the Liberals, is fully committed to the reopening drive, as Daniel Andrews has demonstrated, in line with its character as a party of big business and the banks. And the unions have used the pandemic to take their decades-long collaboration with governments and the employers to new heights. They've backed government handouts to big business since the start of last year, which amount to more than $400 billion. The unions ensured that 2020 was the year with the fewest days lost to industrial action in Australia's history, as they imposed cuts to wages and conditions on the grounds that workers had to sacrifice to ensure that their industries weathered the COVID crisis. And now they're collaborating with the drive to lift lockdowns. The teachers' unions in New South Wales have cautiously welcomed a plan to force their members back into classrooms that will function as petri dishes of the virus. The health unions are working with the state governments in drawing up the plans for a code black, having isolated and diffused industrial action over wages and conditions prior to the current outbreak. And the unions covering industrial workers, such as construction, are joining with the employers to demand an end to capacity limitations and any other safety measures that impinge on private profit. The fight for the social rights of the working class, including to health and life itself, requires new organisations of struggle, including independent rank and file committees in all of the schools, hospitals, and factories. These are the only means workers have to share information, develop a democratic discussion, link up across industries and more broadly, and coordinate the industrial and political action required to defeat the ruling class offensive on the pandemic front, as well as on the issues of jobs, wages, and conditions. Above all, the situation here and internationally poses more starkly than ever the need for international socialism. As principled epidemiologists have explained, it's entirely possible to eradicate the coronavirus through the implementation of public health measures, including genuine lockdowns involving workplace shutdowns with full compensation to all affected workers. But these measures, which can only succeed if they are carried out on a global scale, are blocked by the dominance over society of a tiny corporate and financial elite. That's why the fight against the pandemic is also the fight to build a socialist movement, the working class, and why these laws must be defeated and the SEP registered so we can advance this perspective as widely as possible. Thanks.
Thanks, Oscar. Our final speaker today is Eric London, a member of the National Committee of the SEP in the United States, a prominent writer on the World Socialist website, and author of Agents, the FBI and GPU Infiltration of the Trotskyist Movement, which sheds new light on how governments in the United States and the Soviet Union tried to destroy the World Trotskyist Movement in the 1930s and 1940s. Welcome very much, Eric.
Thank you, Comrade Mike. Well, thank you for inviting me to this meeting, and thank you to those who are in attendance. Permit me to begin my remarks by wondering what one of my better countrymen might have thought about the Australian legislature's official explanation as to why prior state approval is not required for parties to use the word democratic, as opposed to words like socialist, as parties scramble to satisfy the new arduous standards for party status. The pertinent part of the law reads, quote, "The word democratic has a unique position as being directly related to the intrinsic function of all Australian political organizations," end quote. Now, picture the author and satirist Mark Twain reading in his morning paper that the oh-so-democratic Australian legislature had just passed a bill that removes political parties from participating in its democratic process. As others have already explained, the bill was so necessary to uphold democracy that it had to be rushed through nervously in a 24-hour period behind the backs of the population without any public attention in the media beforehand. And the legislature effectively created a rule that Socialist Alliance now gets to veto whether any other party can use the word socialist. And imagine Mark Twain reading that the same legislature, which oversees a society riven by social inequality, which is so weak and isolated from the masses of people that it seeks to effectively ban political competition. Imagine him reading that this same legislature had written in the statutory text that the word democratic has a unique position as being directly related to the intrinsic function of all political organizations in Australia. Twain might have said with his sardonic smile, "Is that so?" Now, as for the real state of capitalist democracy, in the 20 years since the events of September 11th, 2001, the world has heard a lot about the glory of capitalist democracy. We have indeed come to learn quite a bit about how directly related to the intrinsic function of all political organizations democracy, as they call it, is in both Australia and the United States. The death toll of the imperialist wars of the last 20 years is well over 1 million. All the capitalist political parties, all the corporate media outlets, both liberal and conservative, and the governments of the United States and its imperialist allies have referenced democracy ad nauseum as the justification for the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the bombing campaigns of Syria and Libya, the drone strikes in Somalia, Yemen, Pakistan, etc. Capitalist democracy introduced the world to terms like waterboarding, extraordinary rendition, unlawful enemy combatant, and weapons of mass destruction. Capitalist democracy has taught us about the following places that we didn't know existed: Abu Ghraib, the Guantanamo Bay prison, the Bagram Air Force Base, and other black site dungeons where unspeakable crimes were carried out by the American armed forces and its close allies. Through their criminal wars, the US ruling class, with the active participation of the ruling classes of Britain and Australia, has sucked the last domestic life out of whatever remained of home democracy before the wars began. Each ruling class has set up jails where it keeps its immigrants concentrated and in isolation from society on the basis of bogus anti-terror laws. The governments have created a division in which those who are not citizens, or in Australia's case, even those who have dual citizenship, are deprived of the democratic rights of their neighbors. The United States claims for itself the power to assassinate even American citizens without warrant or trial, to spy on the entire world's population, and to grant its own police a license to kill on the streets of its own cities. 20 years of cultivating a political climate of nationalism, militarism, xenophobia, and anti-terror hysteria poured the fuel on the fire that Donald Trump lit. The debacle of the occupation of Afghanistan and the withdrawal of US troops last month marked another catastrophic milestone for world imperialism. The ruling class leveled entire societies. And what did it get them? They only ended up weakening their own geopolitical position and tearing their own societies apart. They claimed they were bringing democracy to the world, but they only ended up laying the foundation for the development of fascist movements at home. The response of the world capitalist powers to the pandemic reveals a similar social approach as that leveled by the so-called coalition of the willing against the people of Central Asia and the Middle East. The stock market means everything, the death toll, nothing. The benefit of Australia's geographic isolation, as Comrade Oscar has just laid out, is being negated by the international coming together of the world's ruling classes in their policy of killing workers and children by keeping workplaces and schools open in order to continue corporate profits and fuel the rise of the stock markets. There are now 4.6 million dead worldwide and no end in sight as the governments refuse to enact the only policy that could stop the endless waves of death, and that is a strategy based on eradicating the virus, shutting schools and non-essential production, and providing full pay for workers to quarantine and safely stop the spread. Now, the Australian legislature says that democracy has a unique position and is intrinsic to all Australian political organizations. But how can democracy exist under these conditions when all of society's resources are handed over to the financial aristocracy as millions die of preventable disease? How can any capitalist government that pursues these policies bear any relation to democracy? How can it wage a state of permanent colonial wars and ride roughshod on democratic rights in the name of fighting terrorism and still delude itself into thinking, after all these years, that the world working class believes their lies for a second? Such delusions are signs of fundamental weakness underlying the capitalist system, not of strength. In the United States, we are told democracy is making a great resurgence once again. The past 4 years of Trump, years marked by the creep of dictatorship and the threat of war and martial law, were an aberration, we are told. Democracy is now returning to the land through the Biden administration, the kindly old grandfather who saved us from Trump, and through the Democratic Party. But this narrative is exploded by an event which took place on August 29th outside the Kabul airport, where US troops pursuing the ruthless interests of corporate America were conducting their supposed withdrawal, which now we know based on the alliance that was announced is based not on a pull away from war and imperialism, but on a switch to the greater prize, to opposing China. But on August 29th, the United States launched a strike that killed, at the time we were told, a number of important terrorists. Leaders of the military, including Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, told the world in press conferences that they had good intelligence that the people that had just been taken out by this bomb attack were about to kill American soldiers at the Kabul airport. In reality, the 10 people that the United States killed on August 29th were innocent civilians, including 7 children who hadn't lived a day of their lives without the occupation. This is from a government that it claims it is defending the rights of children to go to school. The intelligence that was revealed through public reporting shows that the military mistook water jugs for bombs, that they mistook children for terrorists, and that they mistook an engineer who had been working actually for a US nonprofit as some terrorist mastermind. And in the aftermath of the publication of this horrific crime, the military leader responsible for ordering the attack indicated that he thought that they could buy off the families of those dead with a couple $1,000s as the United States leaves the country in which the population is expected to confront a famine this winter that will kill and possibly affect up to 5 million people. This horrific crime, which so epitomizes the total state of criminality of the 20 years of the occupation, went with just about a 90-second segment on the national news last evening. This crime and all the other crimes like it were prepared by every official institution in American politics. The Democratic Party, the Republican Party voted almost unanimously for the war in Afghanistan. The New York Times prepared it. The government took advantage of the situation to pass the Patriot Act, to establish mass surveillance programs like Stellar Wind. They've imprisoned Julian Assange for telling the truth about the war crimes US imperialism was perpetrating in the Middle East and Central Asia. Now, these great democracies get to decide which political parties can participate in the political process. In recent days, as others have said on this call already, we have been informed by the corporate media that the great Anglo-Saxon democracies of the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States are to join forces against the authoritarian Chinese. These 3 partners who committed horrible war crimes in the course of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan say they will keep the world and the Straits of Malacca and the Spratly Islands safe for democracy. But this election law can only be seen in this context, in the context of preparation for new wars, context of the threat of wars between nuclear-armed powers, wars which cannot be allowed to take place, because if they do, they would make Neville Shute's horrible book on the beach a reality. And the closeness in time with which the AUKUS announcement and the election law were introduced make clear that the preparations for war abroad are combined inextricably with attacks on democratic rights at home. After all, the US declared for itself the power to remove an elected prime minister in 2010 when its embassy orchestrated the replacement of the Rudd government with the more compliant anti-Chinese government of Gillard. To carry out their imperialist aims, the leaders of the Democratic AUKUS alliance are reintroducing yellow peril anti-Chinese propaganda, claiming that the pandemic originated in a Wuhan lab, a lie that was promoted by Trump and legitimized by Biden and spread by the same propagandists who lied about weapons of mass destruction. They are digging into profoundly reactionary traditions in both countries. Like the state-promoted anti-Muslim hysteria that engulfed the United States after September 11th, this fanning of racial hatred paves the way, is an attempt to pave the way for war, to divide the working class, undermine the struggle of socialism, and redirect social tensions into a devastating foreign conflict. Their claims of a healthy democratic alliance are, of course, belied by very recent history. Australia and Britain are joining the fight for democracy with the United States when not even a year has passed from the events of January 6th, when Donald Trump attempted to block the official counting of the Electoral College in an attempt to stay in power after having been defeated by several million votes in the 2020 election. He had support from the police in the Capitol, who pulled back and allowed the attack to take place. He had support from powerful elements within the military, who provided him with a window of almost 200 minutes in which he could mobilize his fascist supporters to enter the Capitol building. He had weeks before told his fascist Proud Boys to stand back and stand by, and he almost succeeded. Now, there's new copycat actions by Brazil's president, Jair Bolsonaro, and the process in the United States has been met with a total cover-up by the Democratic Party, which has effectively stopped conducting any investigation into the events. And we learned only several days ago how serious the ruling class took these events when Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, warned that he had actually been forced to call the Chinese military and warn them that Trump was on the verge of establishing a dictatorship and that he would possibly launch a nuclear attack on Chinese soil. Now, the ruling class attempts to ban the Socialist Equality Party from the political marketplace of ideas. This is part of an international process. The financial aristocracy learned the lessons of history. They know, or at least they, in their eyes, the French aristocracy under Louis XVI was undone by the fact that they convoked the Estates General in 1789. The conclusion they draw today is that the great masses of working people can have no voice whatsoever in official capitalist politics. Even the possibility of one member of the Socialist Equality Party in Parliament would threaten to explode the entire war plans and their backroom deals with American imperialism. And any representation of the social interests of the working class whatsoever would spark discussions that would provoke the unraveling of the apparently mighty state apparatus like a ball of yarn. During the 2020 presidential elections, the Socialist Equality Party in the United States faced similar attempts to ban us, although on a somewhat more temporary basis. Democratic governors in Michigan and California ordered that we would not be allowed to appear on the ballots. And when we filed lawsuits in federal court, the courts of appeals, staffed by judges appointed by Trump, Obama, Clinton, and Bush, all put forward the pseudo-legal rationale that we should be forced to risk our lives, the lives of our members, and the lives of the public by soliciting tens or hundreds of thousands of signatures in the middle of a pandemic, when such actions would have been reckless and when they were in fact illegal. There is no constituency in the world's ruling class anywhere for the defense of democratic rights. The Sri Lankan government has enacted emergency rule, banning the right to strike and severely restricting the rights of working people under the pretense of food scarcity, when the real aim is to suppress growing opposition in the working class. The French ruling class deployed incredible force against the yellow vest protests in recent years. And in Germany, the fascist Alternative for Germany now occupies a prominent position in the Bundestag and in many state parliaments. We don't foster illusions that capitalist democracy will bring about a fundamental social change in the interest of working people, but we will fight for every inch of our democratic rights, knowing that we are defending much more than the right to mark the socialist equality on an election ballot, as critical as that right is. We are defending the democratic and social rights of the entire working class, that powerful social force at whose feet the task of defending democratic rights falls. For this reason, we make the point that the actions of the state come not from positions of strength, but of profound weakness. Only unstable regimes ban their political opponents from the ballot. They fear the power of revolutionary ideas. They know that the word that they are most afraid of, socialism, is growing in popularity. And they also view with extreme concern the growing movement of strikes and protests from below. I'll conclude with an example of developments in the United States. where 3,500 auto parts workers at the corporation Dana, which is one of the 500 most powerful corporations in the world, confront working conditions worse than those that preceded the rise of industrial unions in the 20th century. In factories that are organized by two of the most powerful unions in the United States, the United Auto Workers and the United Steel Workers, auto workers have no rights whatsoever. The workplace is a dictatorship enforced by the company and the so-called unions. The coronavirus is spreading like never before, and workers report that they are told to lie to their coworkers if they test positive and to continue showing up for work. Workers are told that if their coworkers collapse on the line, they are to keep working, and that maintaining production is more important than saving the lives of their brothers and sisters on the line. What an apt analogy for the policy that the ruling class has enacted in the context of the pandemic. But these workers have courageously defeated a contract that the union and the company attempted to propose by a margin of 9-1. They are fighting. They have established a network, a committee, the Dana Workers Rank and File Committee. They are appealing to teachers, to auto workers at the major assembly plants, to Amazon workers, to nurses, to critical healthcare workers, and they are fighting to expand their struggle for democracy in the workplace and for an end to the policy of social murder that is carried out by both factions of the ruling class. And it's this, the international working class, that is the social force that is capable of leading that is capable of leading all layers of society, all progressive layers, in a fight to defend democratic rights. And this requires a fight against the capitalist system. And we encourage those who are here to take up the fight with us to defend our democratic rights. And we will work on an international level to inform the working class in every workplace that this attack is taking place and that it must be opposed. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric. Well, we've had 3 very comprehensive reports. And I think we've explained very clearly the definite connection between these totally anti-democratic laws and the underlying political situation, the danger of war, the pandemic, the ever greater inequality. And as Eric has just said, how can these governments claim to be democratic? What a mockery. They can't bring forward these laws without enormous secrecy. And the same with the AUKUS alliance. Well, we have some questions coming in, and we now open up for any questions that anyone wants to put to the speakers. There's a couple of questions perhaps we could start with quite specifically about one of the lies and cover-ups of this pandemic, and that is the so-called hospital in the home program. There are a couple of questions about this. Hospital in the homes program means that people are dying at home. And one question was whether these deaths are even being counted in the official tally, and whether the deaths of so-called non-COVID patients are also being recorded, given the impact on the hospital system. So perhaps we'll start with that. And while we take answers on that, we can please consider any other questions you'd like to submit to the speakers.
Well, Mike, I'll address that question, and maybe Oscar wants to add to it. I mean, there are 14,000 active cases in New South Wales at the moment, and all of them purportedly are being monitored by New South Wales Health, which of course is totally impossible with the resources that the health department has. Of those, 3,500 are under the hospital in the home program, and they are certainly not counted as being in hospital. So I think it was 1,400 that are in hospital, those that are in ICU, they don't count any of the hospital in the home. And certainly the deaths that are attributed to COVID of who are in the home, which is why there's so many people dying at home. And it wasn't clear at all initially when the pandemic resurfaced here, why so many people were dying at home. And that's the reason. There was an article actually in the Saturday paper yesterday, which outlined the precarious, the absolutely irresponsible nature of this program, in which oximeters, which are designed to test the level of of oxygen in the blood, and which are supposed to be provided to those that require what is classified as hospital grade treatment in the home. In fact, they're not supplied with it. And the paramedic who was interviewed for this article outlined that he took measurements and stats of these patients and found that their oxygen levels were below 50%, whereas they're supposed to be over 96%, and asked the patient how they felt, and they felt fine, because one of the characteristics, it seems, of the Delta variant is a camouflaging of certain conditions, and one of them is of low oxygen levels until it gets to a critical point, at which point they die. And the paramedic said, you should be dead with these readings. And so it is very clear that the hospital in the home program is designed to ensure that people don't go to hospital because the hospitals couldn't deal with it. Already, as Oscar went through, Liverpool Hospital has stopped taking COVID patients. Westmead is at a point where and this is the largest hospital in the country, or the second largest, is about to run out of oxygen. You have the same conditions which were evidenced certainly in India, in areas where hospitals have run out of oxygen, that are now taking place in this country. And one of the elements also is all the modelling which the Doherty Institute put forward, and outlined certain criteria. None of it even referenced the ambulance service, which, as it's clear, if the ambulance service doesn't function, then patients can't get to hospital. And this article also outlined, which we will report on, that in fact the ambulance service in New South Wales has already reached what is classified as stage 3. Stage 3 is when there are no ambulances that can be sent to 000 calls. That stage had only ever, and of that stage, of which the highest is this arbitrary number of 150, that 150 stage had never been reached before, other than once in the previous 10 years. It has now occurred multiple times throughout Sydney, and not in one area alone, but throughout multiple areas of Sydney. So you have a hospital system in which the ambulance service has already reached capacity and over. And as this paramedic said, they don't have figures which go beyond 150 because the system was never designed to get to 150, let alone beyond. So how bad it is now is not unable to be gauged because there are no measures to deal with this. So all the figures that have been put forward by certainly the New South Wales government, which the health unions have never queried, have never raised, are spurious to say the least. In Victoria, while the figures appear to be better, one of the reasons that they appear better is because Victoria has already instituted ambulance and paramedic responses where only one paramedic, where they're single paramedic responses, which is entirely unsustainable. And that's the reason that they're able to present what are, again, completely spurious figures. And so you have paramedics having to drive to jobs. These are life-threatening conditions which many of these patients face by themselves. And of course, the situation in all the other states has actually reached crisis point. And in most of the other states, other than the ACTU, there are no community transmissions reported. And so the hospital system in all the states are either on the brink of collapse without COVID or are now beyond capacity. The figures of people who have died, not with COVID, but because they can't get proper treatment, no, they're not. They're not counted in the COVID figures. But I mean, what I think has to be outlined is that all these conditions, while it is a coalition government in New South Wales, the National Cabinet, which has functioned since March of 2020, which is the combination of the federal government and all the state governments, the majority of which are Labor, all of them know this. All the deliberations of the National Cabinet, which is not an elected, it's not Parliament, it has no answerability to Parliament. All the deliberations are banned from being accessed under freedom of information. But all these figures, all these circumstances are known by Labor governments and also by the unions. And they have presided over what has been decades-long destruction of the hospital system, as well as the completely crippled state of the hospital system now. And the role that these unions have played is to suppress, to isolate, to keep separate all the struggles which have developed prior to this outbreak by health workers, certainly over wages, conditions, and ratios. All of that have been kept suppressed and isolated. And so the unions and Labor play an absolutely pivotal role in the situation which now confronts certainly the hospital system and, of course, the patients and the workers under these conditions.
Oscar, did you want to add to that at all?
Just very briefly, I mean, I think the main points have been raised. I mean, the governments in New South Wales and elsewhere claim that the hospitals will be able to cope. I mean, it's clear that one of their strategies is just not to admit patients, regardless of whether they require care or not. I think the fact that there are 3,500 COVID patients of the New South Wales hospital system who are actually at home is a revelation to most people. I mean, it's never mentioned in the daily press briefings. Government ministers have not been questioned about this. It is generally whistleblowing health workers and others who are revealing the situation, and the conditions that they're exposing are very dire. It's clear that these people are not being provided with the care that they require. I think just on the other part of the question, it is important whether people who die not from COVID, from other conditions, because the hospital system is overwhelmed, will be counted as deaths caused by COVID. Cheryl said they won't. But it raises a key issue. I mean, health workers have made the point. Intensive care units are the nerve centre of the entire hospital system. I mean, if they're overwhelmed, as is forecast to take place, particularly in New South Wales, but also elsewhere, the ability for other care to be provided is severely compromised. I mean, already you have health staff from non-respiratory sectors of the hospitals being brought into the COVID wards, cardiologists and others. That's having a huge flow-on effect. I think that the president of the Australian Medical Associations have summed it up when he said you don't want to have a heart attack or be diagnosed with cancer in October because it's not clear what will happen to you. So I think that the situation is very dire, and one of the main points is there is just this complete conspiracy of silence, which is not just the coalition government in New South Wales or the Morrison government, it's the entire political establishment, Labor, the Liberals, the corporate press, who are covering up just how serious the situation is.
Thanks, Oscar. Look, we've got a whole host of questions now, but we can still take some more. And if we don't get to them all, we'll certainly reply to them after the meeting. There's one question, perhaps for Eric, about the book published this week in the United States by Bob Woodward and another journalist called Peril, which revealed that General Milley, the Chief of Staff of the American military, Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, rang his Chinese counterpart twice to warn him against the danger, or to say that the US wasn't going to attack China straight away. Perhaps you could speak on that, Eric, because it does shed further light on the danger of war.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. Well, perhaps to begin, there has been a section of the affluent middle class, including people who once considered themselves left-wing, people like Glenn Greenwald, Caitlin Johnston, and others who have argued that the events of January 6th were really not all that important, that there is really nothing to see there, that the obligation of, or even actually, as some of them do, to lionize those who participated. Sure, there was some people who were wearing shirts memorializing Auschwitz, meaning celebrating Auschwitz. But by and large, it was just a bunch of working people who came to the Capitol on that day to protest in one way or another against perceived inequalities and injustices. Let us just be absolutely clear that such responses have absolutely nothing to do with the fight for socialism and absolutely nothing to do with the fight to defend the democratic rights of the population. The revelations that General Mark Milley was so concerned about the possibility of a military dictatorship in the United States, and was so concerned about the possibility that in the crisis of the immediate aftermath of January 6th, that the president himself, as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, would issue an order to launch nuclear weapons on populated cities of China, which would have resulted in a retaliation that, if it had happened, probably would have meant that most of you living in Melbourne and Sydney would not be here right now. And to those middle-class people who say that there really wasn't very much happening on January 6th, that we're all just exaggerating, that the media invented this event, they should read this book because it shows just how absolutely distant they are from the concerns of the broad masses of people who do not want to live under dictatorship and who do not want Donald Trump to be able to come and tell 300 million people who they voted for as president. In this context, the Socialist Equality Party doesn't reference Milley as a defender of democratic rights. Part of the importance of the analysis which we have presented of this event is to make the point that the danger of the situation is that the Democratic Party, even when their own representatives were huddled in the basement of the United States Capitol, wondering whether they were calling their relatives and saying goodbye for the last time, that even under those conditions, the Democratic Party did not make a popular appeal, did not issue any tweets, and this includes Pelosi, Schumer, but also ostensibly left-wing people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders. All it would have taken to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people from the surrounding working class districts within located blocks away from the Capitol building in Washington would have been to post a 30-second video on Twitter appealing for the biggest demonstration in American history to stamp out Trump's fascist coup attempt. None of them did this, not a single one of them. And the real crime is not exaggerating the event of January 6th, but of understating it and of aiding and abetting the Democratic Party as they cover up for Trump, as they cover up for his accomplices, including the figures like Josh Hawley, Republican senator of Missouri, who gave thrust his fist in the air at the January 6th crowd, including Ted Cruz, who remains in the Senate and has participated in discussions on the events of January 6th after the fact. And we have to make the most forceful warning that the events which we're here tonight to discuss in Australia and the events which took place on January 6th in the United States and the whole degeneration over a protracted period of all of the official institutions of capitalist rule, whether they are the military, whether they are the media, whether they are the capitalist parties. Of course, these are not institutions which, at least not since the progressive bourgeois revolutions of the 18th and in the case of the United States, the Civil War of 1861 to 65, have had anything since then to do with progressive politics. But we are, but the fact that this event on January 6th got so close reveals a tremendous amount about the rot at the center of official political life in the United States and internationally. In the United Kingdom, one sees a similar process playing out with Brexit and Boris Johnson, who I can't even quote what he said verbatim on this call because of the foul language, but he said, "Let the bodies pile up in the tens of thousands," in response to demands from the City of London that there be no restrictions on profit, no restrictions on the accumulation of wealth by the few in the middle of the pandemic. And if I could just make one more point. In the United States, there is also an attempt to say that January 6th was not really that big of a deal because America has always been a fascist country. They often, this type of radical will spell America with a K or with 3 Ks to indicate that it's always been just nothing but the Ku Klux Klan. And a lot of their attempt to downplay the dangers today are related to an attempt to attack the American Revolution of 1776 and the Civil War as nothing but groups of white racists, whether it's the revolutionaries who wrote the Declaration of Independence, declaring that all men are created equal, men are endowed with certain inalienable rights. That is, just to speak of, and then in the case of the Civil War, that slavery could not exist in a bourgeois democratic society. Just in relation to the point about the attack on the rights of the people and workers in Australia to select the party that they want to choose for. The attack on the bourgeois revolutions, and we are socialists, we understand, as Marx wrote, capitalism comes into the world dripping in blood and filth at every pore. The bourgeois revolutions were bourgeois. They could not establish equality. They could try to establish equality under the law, but the development of capitalism and the levels of social inequality, which developed in the aftermath of the bourgeois revolutions in France and the United States and England, et cetera, showed that and it was actually out of this contradiction that the socialist movement of the early 1800s developed. But the point is that under conditions where democratic consciousness has been so eroded, and under conditions where the ruling class in every country is doing everything it possibly can to abolish the right to vote, where Trump says he gets to decide who's president, where the Australian government says they get to decide who gets to be on the ballot and who gets to participate in official political discourse. Under these conditions, we reject very, very strongly the attempts to say that even the bourgeois revolutions were nothing but reactionary slave owners, charters, etc. I'm not sure those of you who are reading who have not been following the coverage of the 1619 Project, which was a racialist interpretation of history, falsifying the aims of the bourgeois revolutionaries in an earlier period, presenting American history as nothing but a bunch of racist white people. This has nothing to do with progressive politics. It has nothing to do with objective history. I'd encourage you, if you have not studied this material already, and if maybe my remarks are not therefore all that clear to you, to really study this material and try and understand this, because racial and identity politics it only serves to pit workers against each other, to divide them, and to create a historical narrative which is based on preparing the field for the further evisceration of democratic rights today.
Thanks, Eric. That's very clarifying. Look, we have on the call Nick Beams, who wants to make some points about wealth inequality. Just while Nick is being set up, there was an earlier question about the Communist Party dissolution bill. Just very briefly on that. Absolutely, the Australian ruling class has never been democratic. The right to vote isn't even in the Constitution in 1901. And there was a move after World War II, at the beginning of the so-called Cold War, to ban the Communist Party of Australia. In that sense, ban socialism in any form by the Menzies government using the war power, the defence power. That was ruled unconstitutional by the High Court. There was a division on that. But then Menzies tried to put it to a referendum and was defeated. And I think that actually speaks volumes about the democratic sensibilities, in that sense, of the working class in Australia, the opposition to any moves to outlaw socialist parties, to ban dissent. And that's certainly what we're seeking to develop against these laws. Just because they've gone through Parliament doesn't mean this battle is over by any means whatsoever. And we're appealing, to the broadest layers of workers to defend democratic rights, as Eric says, within the context, of course, not that we think Parliament represents democracy in any way, realistic way, but we stand absolutely for the defence of the democratic rights of the working class. And we think the experience of 1950-51 is actually an important one, both about the anti-democratic character of the Australian capitalist class and the possibility of a mass movement, against this ruling class. But I'll hand over now to Nick Beams, who wants to make some points about the growth of inequality during the pandemic. Welcome, Nick Beams.
Well, I'd just like to make the following points, which I think pertain to the analysis that we've made. I mean, we've seen a situation unprecedented at any time, really, apart from war. Millions are dying. Millions are having their lives disrupted. Millions are facing poverty, billions all around the world. And yet nothing is done to stop this pandemic. Well, it's a different situation among the financial elites. Let me just give you a couple of figures. The world's billionaires, since the start of this pandemic in March 2020, have increased their wealth, that's the global billionaires, by $5.5 trillion. They saw their wealth climb from $8 trillion in March 2020 to 13.5 trillion as of the end of July, and it's gone up since then. Now, that's an increase in global billionaire wealth in the past 17 months, more than it did in the 15 years prior to the pandemic. It rose from 2006 to 2020 from 2.65 trillion to 8 trillion. That was bad enough. That was a result of the policies of the Federal Reserve and other central banks to pour money into the financial system to enable the speculation on the stock market to continue. But then it accelerated with the start of the pandemic. And of course, the Australian billionaire class have not been outside of this process. The top 250 have increased their combined wealth from $377 billion to $470 billion, double the increase from 2019 to 2020. And just to give you an example of what that means, one of the top billionaires in Australia, Mr. Forrest of Fortescue Metals, has increased his wealth by about $857 million each year for the past decade. That is, he increases his wealth at the rate of $2.35 million per day. Now, in exposing these facts, we see the objective reason why no effective measures based on eradication are being implemented by any capitalist government, Liberal, Labor, Liberal, Conservative, whatever, pseudo-left, whatever, around the world, because of its effect that those measures would have on this mountain of speculative capital. Now, I'm not talking here on the top of my head here or producing some conjecture about the future. This, in fact, is what already happened. In March 2020, when the pandemic first developed and there were wildcat strikes in the United States and movements by other sections of workers around the world for effective measures to deal with the pandemic, such was the fear in the ruling classes of what effect this would have on the stock market bubble, that the market in fact tanked in New York. Wall Street collapsed, not only the share market, but in fact, the $21 trillion US Treasury market froze. This led to the massive intervention by the Fed of the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, to pump into the financial markets $4 trillion. At one stage, they were pumping in $1 million a second to keep the markets afloat. Now, that's the reason for no effective measures for reopening, the reopening of schools, let it rip, Boris Johnson, whatever, because effective measures to deal with the pandemic would bring down this mountain of fictitious capital and wealth that has been created by the ruling classes. That's the essential driving force. And so it raises, so the financial sector is like the old god, the Moloch of ancient times, who demanded the sacrifice of human bodies to his interests, demands the sacrifice of children, as we're now seeing. That must be overturned. That domination must be overturned. So the fight against the pandemic is essentially, as we have emphasized, a political fight. And it must be based on a socialist program which ends the domination of this financial Moloch, this god of finance, which demands sacrifice so that its profit interests can be maintained. So there's an inseparable connection here at work. This is the real driving force. Not just individual companies, big pharma and others play their role and so on, but it's the essential domination over society of finance capital, which must be ended by the working class as the first step towards reorganizing the whole economy on socialist foundations so that the welfare of people can be placed front and center and the priority over the interests of finance.
Thanks, Nick. And I'm sorry, I should have introduced Nick as it's been put in the chat. Nick, of course, is well known to many of our regular readers, a member of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist website, a regular writer on world economy, and a long-time former National Secretary of the SEP in Australia. Thank you very much, Nick. Now, there's two main lines or chains of questions perhaps speakers could address. There's one chain relates to what was the response of the Greens, independents, what is the, should the left so-called all unite? And then there's another chain of questions. What is the next step? Do we need a new French Revolution? How can we do this during the lockdown? Perhaps those two chains of questions speakers might want to speak on. Cheryl?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's also the question of the vaccine passport. So I'll just deal with a few of those questions initially. I mean, first of all, in regards to the Greens voted against the legislation in the Senate, didn't in the House of Representatives. They put forward an amendment that there should only be 1,000 signatures that are required, and that would be and that existing registered parties would be exempted. That was rejected, and the legislation was passed, and as we've outlined, it went through both the House of Representatives and the Senate within 24 hours. They have remained entirely silent on these laws. They have made no statement on it, either before or after. And they have completely fallen into line with the government and Labor. And it also needs to be stated that Labor didn't just agree with this. I mean, Labor argued vociferously. If the listeners look at Hansard, it is predominantly Labor MPs in the House of Representatives who argued for this legislation on the basis that to stand in the election, to be registered and to stand in the election under one's name, under one's party name, is a privilege, not a right. Milton Dick put forward that all these whingers and whiners who talk about, democracy and all the rest of it, they should just be thankful and shut up. I mean, this was Labor. These were not, inactive. They played an essential role in the process of this legislation. And I think also just bound up with the issue of the pandemic itself. Our movement and science, those principled epidemiologists, scientists, medical staff who understand and have fought for a program and a perspective of eradication, is in line with what is necessary for society as a whole, for mankind as a whole. It is not necessary that this virus is able to circulate, to develop, to mutate into different variants unchecked. There is, of course, those who like Johnson, put forward, let it rip, all the advantages for, as he said, letting the bodies pile high. And then there are those who put forward suppression, mitigation. And the issue of vaccine passports is part and parcel of that. there is a position that is put forward throughout governments, not just in this country, but internationally, that vaccination is the key to the ending of lockdowns. It is not. It is an important element. It is an important aspect of it, but vaccines in and of themselves do not stop transmission. They can reduce the level of the severity of the virus, but there are many hundreds of breakthrough infections taking place of fully vaccinated individuals. There are those who are dying who are fully vaccinated. And of course, under conditions where in no country are children vaccinated, and there's not even vaccinations that are eligible, in which children are eligible, and the demand for schools to reopen, that this is a requirement, has nothing to do with the education or the mental health concerns which are used as the justification, but are bound up wholly and solely with the requirement of releasing parents to go back into factories, to go back into workplaces, and to provide profits, to produce profits. Eradication, as the epidemiologists who participated in our online scientists panel, and who have also been interviewed on the pages of the World Socialist website, have outlined that vaccines with public health measures and stringent lockdowns, not the lockdowns that are evident here, where pubs and gyms and certain retails, although most retails aren't lockdown, but everything else opens up. That is not a lockdown. What is required is the stringent lockdowns of all non-essential production. Those workers who are unable to work, to be compensated and provided with payments from the wealth, which Comrade Nick outlined very aptly in the previous contribution, all of which have gone to the coffers of the tiny elite. There is no lack of finances. And of course, one element that we have not in that sense dealt with today is that this alliance between the United States, the United Kingdom and Australia, and the drive to war, the build-up, whether it's submarines, whether it's bases, whether it's the development of aircraft, warships, all of that is going to cost billions and in fact trillions of dollars, all of which will be sucked from the livelihoods, the working conditions of the working class. When we talk about war abroad means war against the working class at home, that is precisely what is going to be carried out. And so the finances which are being utilised for war, being utilised for Wall Street and the coffers of the capitalist few, need to be expropriated and paid to ordinary workers who are unable to work. And epidemiologists have estimated that even the Delta variant could be eradicated within a couple of months were these measures to be undertaken. And of course, the international collaboration between scientists, between epidemiologists and medical staff in developing more effective vaccines, of course, would then be enabled. And so the whole issue of vaccine passports, not only is it entirely incapable of being enforced, it is completely ineffective, and in fact is being put forward as a means of not carrying through the eradication and the elimination of the virus as a whole. So I'll just leave those points, and possibly Oscar or others can deal with some of the others.
Oscar, would you like to come in here? Question, anything on these issues or the other questions of do we need a new revolution?
Yeah, I think a number of the comments or questions raise the issue of how the legislation and the broader assault on democratic rights can be fought. So there are several exchanges about the feasibility of, I think the term used is infiltrating government parties at the branch level, and presumably seeking to shift their policies. There are other questions about the positions of the Greens and the like. I think, as Marxists, we make a class assessment of every political tendency. And if you look at all of the official parties here, no less than in the US or Britain, these are parties of the banks and big business. They have nothing to do with the interests of the working class. They're intensely hostile to those interests. And if you look at the Labor Party, which, for decades and decades, did have a mass working class base and membership. I mean, that's not been the case for the past 40 to 50 years. I mean, it was Labor in this country that implemented the sweeping economic restructuring, the assault on the working class associated with Reagan in the United States, Thatcher in Britain. It was Hawke and Keating here who smashed up manufacturing and really initiated an assault on the working class, which hasn't ended. And if you look at really every political question, I mean, these laws, the Labor Party was at the forefront of pushing them through. The Greens have no principled or serious opposition. Likewise, on the issue of war, I mean, it was the Labor governments of particularly Julia Gillard who aligned Australia with the advanced US preparations for conflict with China. Labor has supported every US war over the course of decades. So I think that the critical issue is to recognise that there is no political voice, political representation for the working class within the existing setup. The SEP is the only party, along with its sister parties in the ICFI, fighting for the independent interests of the working class. And that does mean, in this period, a revolutionary perspective. I mean, we are living through a breakdown crisis of capitalism. And what is offered is the catastrophe of the pandemic, the pro-business response to it, but also the looming threat of nuclear war, authoritarianism and dictatorship. History demonstrates that the way to combat this is to fight for the working class to take political power, begin reorganising society in its own interest, expropriation of the banks, the corporations, billions for healthcare, the dismantling of the military. None of that's possible within the existing political setup. So we do advance, a revolutionary socialist perspective. But I'll just make those points.
Thanks, Oscar. That's very helpful. Look, I'm afraid we will have to wind up the discussion here now, and it's been a very lively one and lots of issues. And we will address all the questions, including in our articles on the World Socialist website in the coming days and weeks. We would like to take up a collection for the Socialist Equality Party Monthly Fund and for the World Socialist website. And one of the questions that we didn't get to was on the role of the corporate media and how do we counter it? Well, one way of doing it, one very powerful way of doing it, is to help maintain and expand the work of the World Socialist website and our social media platforms. We provide the only truthful, objective, accurate account of the political situation and also give a voice to the working class in all the struggles that they're engaging in. Events which are almost entirely blacked out, in the corporate media. Now, we depend entirely on the support, including financial support, that we receive from ordinary people, workers and youth. We do not receive, and we would never accept, any government or corporate funding of any sort. Maintaining the World Socialist website and our social media platforms on a daily basis requires considerable resources. In the light of the rapidly intensifying political situation that we've discussed today, we must intensively expand this work. Please give as generously as possible to the SEP's monthly fund by making a donation or a pledge online now. You can record your donation in the chat, and or by making a regular monthly pledge. The details will be on the screen. If you're donating from outside Australia, you need to do it through the WSWS. I'd like to bring to your attention some of the vast array of Marxist literature available from our online publishing house, Mehring Books. On the screen, you'll see the book I mentioned earlier by Comrade Eric, London, Agents, the FBI and GP Infiltration of the Trotskyist Movement. Very detailed archival evidence has been brought to bear to show the extent to which both US imperialism, US governments, and the Stalinist bureaucracy in the Soviet Union spied on and infiltrated the Trotskyist movement in the 1930s and right through to the 1980s. And of course, that included the assassination of Leon Trotsky in Mexico City in August 1940. And this book is a further contribution to the understanding of just how much both imperialism and Stalinism recognized our movement as the danger to their existence. So that book and many others can be ordered online at mehring.com.au. We have also, directly relevant to today's discussion, Socialism and the Fight Against War, the manifesto issued by our World Party, the International Committee of the Fourth International, calling for the international anti-war movement that is necessary to stop war and overturn the root causes of it, which is in the capitalist profit and nation state system. Also on the screen, A Quarter Century of War by David North, the chairman of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist website, tracing how, beginning from the first Persian Gulf War of 1990-91, the United States has been at war continuously ever since. This presages, is heightening now in the confrontation against China. So it's very important to study this material. We also have available Nick Beam's pamphlet on the development of the Australian Labor Party from Whitlam to Rudd, the development of the anti-strike, pro-union anti-strike laws that Cheryl mentioned earlier, the Accords, the transformation of both labour and the unions into apparatuses which seek to suppress every struggle of the working class, and also a pamphlet on the removal of Rudd in 2010 by a backroom coup orchestrated by US protected sources within the American embassy in order to engage or develop a shift further towards alignment behind the United States. It was the Gillard government that signed the first agreement to have troops in Darwin, etc., which is now being expanded in the latest OSMIN talks in Washington. So these are all really critical material to read. And finally, this latest volume from the International Committee on the real renaissance of Marxism within our movement in the period since the 1985-86 split with the British Workers' Revolutionary Party, the significance of that defeat of Pavlovite opportunist tendencies, and outlining the new period of socialist revolution and the new period of the Trotskyist movement, which has now begun. So we do highly recommend and urge all of our readers and supporters to develop an understanding, develop a library of Marxist literature and study this material as an essential step in your political development. We urge everyone here to apply to become an electoral member of the Socialist Equality Party and ask others, including your family and friends and co-thinkers, to join you. Anyone who agrees with the program and election policies of the SEP and undertakes to support campaigns for the election of our candidates is eligible to apply for electoral membership. An electoral member cannot be a member of any other political party. That's a rule of the SEP, but it's also a requirement of the party registration legislation. And because of the reactionary electoral laws, electoral members must be Australian citizens. They must be eligible to vote and be correctly listed on the electoral roll at their current address. So if you're not enrolled to vote, we urge you to do so and become an electoral member. And please ensure that your enrolment on the electoral roll is up to date at your current address and with your full name, that those details correspond exactly to those on your application for electoral membership. If not, the Electoral Commission will disqualify you as an electoral member. Electoral members must be also ready to confirm their SEP electoral membership as soon as they are emailed or phoned by the AEC, the Electoral Commission, which can occur once our party's list is submitted. We object entirely to this. As Cheryl explained before, it's a complete invasion of democratic rights and the right to secret ballot, but it's a process that we've obliged to undertake if we are to be able to contest elections under our name. But above all, to defeat the agenda of the corporate elite and its political servants, the working class needs a new political leadership based on the lessons of the strategic experiences of the international working class over the past 2 centuries. That historical level of understanding, which is required for full membership of the SEP, is set out and explained in our party's statement of principles. That is why we also urge all electoral members of the SEP to study the statement of principles and consider applying for full membership of the SEP. To conclude, to defeat the bipartisan attempt to silence the struggle for socialism, we appeal to all our existing electoral members, our readers, members of rank and file committees, and all working people, students and youth, and everybody attending this event today. Help us recruit the extra 1,000 electoral members that we need to retain our party registration and take forward the fight for the essential socialist alternative. Thank you all very much for your participation.